November 22nd, 1945. The air in the Rhineland carried the scent of damp earth and coal smoke, a bitter perfume clinging to the ruins of a shattered nation. In the shadow of collapsed walls and half-buried cellars, a group of German women sat in silence, their bodies wrapped in patched coats, their eyes hollow with hunger. They had been gathered into the custody of American troops marked as prisoners. But unlike the chainal marches that had carried men across Europe, this captivity was quieter, more ambiguous. They were neither celebrated civilians nor soldiers, but displaced fragments of a fallen Reich, waiting to see what their conquerors intended to do with them. On this day, though, something unexpected unfolded. American officers had ordered a Thanksgiving meal, an old tradition carried across the Atlantic, even in war. For weeks, supply ships had delivered frozen turkeys, sacks of potatoes, crates of flour, and tins of cranberries. The feast was meant for soldiers far from home, young men who missed their mothers' tables in Iowa, Georgia, or Michigan. Yet the officers made a decision that startled even their own ranks. They extended the invitation to the women held behind the barbed wire, the supposed enemies, the ones raised on years of propaganda, warning that Americans would treat them with cruelty. The women entered the mess hall with wary steps, boots scuffing the wooden floor. Their stomachs clenched at the warm aromas curling through the air, roasted meat, gravy thick with fat, bread fresh from the field ovens. They exchanged quick glances, whispers darting between them in cautious German. Could this be real? Or was it a trick? A humiliation staged to mock their weakness. Some clenched their hands tight, their fingernails rimmed with dirt, prepared for disappointment. The room was not grand. Planks had been hammered together into long tables, tin plates stacked neatly, candles stubbed into bottles to fight the early dusk. But to women who had lived on watery cabbage soup, on bread made from sawdust filler, even the sight of abundance was dizzying. Pots clanged in the background, soldiers joked in English, and in the midst of it all stood rows of steaming turkeys, their golden skin glistening with butter. The contrast was surreal. Conquerors carving meat for the conquered. One woman, perhaps 30, with hair tied back under a ragged scarf, sat stiffly as a GI placed a slice of turkey on her plate. She did not thank him. She could not. Her mind replayed years of warnings. Americans were brutes. Americans would starve them. Americans would laugh as they suffered. Her eyes stayed fixed on the meat as if it might vanish. Another, younger, not more than 20, closed her eyes and inhaled the steam rising from the mashed potatoes. Her lips trembled. It smelled like memory, though she had never eaten such food. It reminded her of stories told before the war, of family gatherings that once belonged to someone else's life. The soldiers moved among them, handing out bread rolls and ladling gravy. There was unease in the air, not only from the women, but from the men serving them. Some GIs were uncomfortable, grumbling that feeding Germans seemed like rewarding the enemy. Others shrugged, muttering that it was Thanksgiving, and what harm could come from filling an empty stomach. For many, the war had ended in May, but the habits of suspicion lingered. Behind every soft gesture stood the memory of comrades lost on beaches and in forests. Yet here, in this hall, smelling of sage and onions, a fragile pause existed. Forks hovered over plates. Conversation stopped. The first taste had not yet been taken. Hunger gnawed at the women, but mistrust held them still. One finally lifted her fork, a motherly figure with grey streaks in her hair, her cheeks hollow, but her posture proud. She brought a morsel of turkey to her lips. For a moment her expression was unreadable. Then, almost against her will, her eyes watered. The meat was tender, seasoned, soaked in juices that reminded her body of what nourishment once felt like. She chewed slowly, as though afraid that swallowing might break the spell. Her quiet surrender opened the gate. Others followed, forks clinking, bites taken, the first sounds of chewing filling the silence. Some women bowed their heads as though in prayer. Tears slid down roughened faces, catching in the lines of exhaustion. To taste butter after years of ersatz margarine, to feel warmth spread from the belly outward, it was more than food. It was a collapse, a recognition that what they had been taught was wrong. The enemy was not poisoning them. The enemy was feeding them. A soldier standing nearby noticed the tears. He shifted awkwardly, muttering under his breath, "It's just turkey." Yet he knew in some part of him it wasn't just turkey. It was a weapon more powerful than bullets. Kindness. Another soldier cracked a dry joke about the bird being overcooked, and to his surprise, a ripple of laughter passed among the women, laughter after years of silence. Even the sound startled them. Outside, the town still lay in rubble. Families searched ruins for coal to burn. Children scavenged for crumbs. The winter promised to be brutal. But here in this hall lit by stubby candles, there was abundance, an island of plenty in a sea of hunger. The contrast was almost unbearable. A young woman clutched her plate with both hands, not for fear it would be stolen, but because it anchored her to a moment that felt like salvation. Her tears fell freely, mixing with the gravy. The conflict, though, did not vanish. Behind the tears lurked shame. To be fed by those they had been told were monsters was a humiliation, a stripping away of the last defenses of pride. Some pushed their plates away halfway through, unable to finish, overwhelmed by the clash of hunger and dignity. One whispered to another, "If my husband could see me now." Her words trailed off, smothered by grief. Still, the meal went on. Candles burned lower, plates emptied, and when the women finally set down their forks, there was a stillness heavier than before. For the first time in years, their stomachs were full. For the first time in months, their captors seemed less like shadows of propaganda and more like men. Yet that very recognition brought its own terror. If the enemy was capable of kindness, then everything else, the hatred, the fighting, the deaths, took on a crueler meaning. What had it all been for? The officers watching from a distance said little. They had expected gratitude, perhaps relief, but they had not expected tears. And as the women dabbed their eyes with frayed sleeves, one soldier leaned to another and murmured, "We just gave them Thanksgiving." But what happens when they start to believe us? That question hung in the candlelit air, heavier than smoke, heavier than the silence that followed. For this was more than a meal. It was the first crack in a wall of lies, a small fracture that promised to widen. And as night fell over the Rhineland, the women carried that taste with them, sweet, salty, tender, and impossible to forget, into a future they did not yet understand. The silence that followed the meal did not linger long. Hunger had been quieted, but the mind, trained for years in suspicion, now began to stir with questions. Around the tables, the women looked at one another with unease. They had swallowed not only turkey and potatoes, but also the collapse of a world carefully constructed by propaganda. It was easier, perhaps, to hate an enemy who never smiled, who never showed mercy. But what did it mean when the supposed monster served you supper? The war had already torn apart their homes and families. Now it began dismantling their certainties. For years, German women had been told that Americans were beasts. Posters had shown caricatures of tall, broad-shouldered men with greedy grins, knives dripping with blood. Newspapers described them as mongrels of mixed races, incapable of honor. Goebbels's speeches hammered the message. To fall into American hands was to invite abuse, humiliation, perhaps worse. These warnings had not been abstract. They had been taught in classrooms, whispered in bomb shelters, passed down like grim scripture. One woman at the table remembered her school teacher insisting that American soldiers would carve swastikas into German children's foreheads. She recalled trembling at the thought, never doubting the truth of it. And yet, when the doors of the missile opened, she had seen no knives raised, no grins of cruelty. She had seen soldiers, young, weary, some not much older than her own brother, carrying trays of food. Her stomach had accepted what her mind could not, the enemy's generosity. Each bite chewed away at a lifetime of conditioning. It was as though the turkey itself argued with Goebbels, and the argument was devastatingly persuasive. The American soldiers were not blind to the irony. Many of them had fought through France, Belgium, and into Germany, burying friends along the way. Some still carried shrapnel wounds beneath their uniforms, reminders etched into flesh. To them, feeding German prisoners felt absurd, even insulting. A private from Ohio muttered to his bunkmate afterward, "My buddy died in the Herkin, and now we're serving turkey to the folks who cheered when he fell." His words carried the bitterness of loss. Yet even he had noticed the tears, the way the women's faces softened as though remembering they were human again. He did not know what to make of that. None of them did. Still, the decision to extend the Thanksgiving meal had not come from sentiment alone. It was policy, subtle but deliberate. By late 1945, the United States sought to distinguish itself from the Soviets, whose treatment of prisoners was notoriously harsh. American officers understood that mercy could be a weapon, that feeding the defeated could create allies where bullets never could. Food, after all, was power in a starving continent. And so what looked like simple generosity was also strategy, though its effects reached deeper than planners could have foreseen. One woman, thin as a reed, held her fork in trembling fingers. She had lost her husband on the Eastern Front, swallowed by the maul of Stalingrad, and her only son to an air raid in Hamburg. To her, life had become nothing but absence. She had expected her captors to treat her as an enemy, to strip her of dignity as punishment for the regime she had once believed in. Instead, she found herself being offered bread warm enough to burn her fingertips. She wept not only for the taste, but for the realization that the world was larger, more complicated than she had been told. She wept because kindness was harder to endure than cruelty. Across from her, another woman whispered to her neighbor, "What if they are only pretending? What if tomorrow they turn on us?" Fear clung tightly, unwilling to let go. Her eyes darted to the soldiers, watching their easy laughter, their careless jokes about the dryness of the turkey. She could not reconcile those images with the warnings engraved in her mind. But doubt, once seated, could not be uprooted. Even in suspicion, she had tasted something that would not be forgotten. The Americans, too, were transformed in small ways. A corporal from Kansas City, who had once stormed a farmhouse and found only frightened civilians inside, said later, "I thought I hated them." But when you see tears over a piece of turkey, you realize hate's a heavy thing to carry. His words did not erase the war, nor did they excuse it. But they revealed a fracture in the wall dividing conqueror and conquered. For a moment, both sides glimpsed something beyond roles assigned by propaganda and battle lines. In the days after the dinner, whispers spread through the camp. Women spoke quietly of the meal, as though mentioning it aloud might break its fragile magic. Some described the flavor with reverence, the crisp skin of the turkey, the creamy mash that melted on the tongue, the bread so soft it seemed impossible after years of hardness. Others spoke of the tears, embarrassed yet unable to deny them. They did not call it kindness, they dared not, but they acknowledged it as something different from what they had been taught to expect. In those murmured recollections, a new narrative began to take root. History is often remembered through battles and treaties, but here, the battlefield was the human heart. The propaganda machine had armed these women with fear sharper than bayonets, but a single meal had pierced through. The contradiction was too striking to ignore. On one hand, their cities still lay in rubble, their families scattered. On the other, the very enemy who had bombed them was now feeding them. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was confusion. And confusion is often the first step toward change. One cannot overlook the numbers. In late 1945, the average German civilian consumed barely 1/200th calories a day, often less in bombed-out regions. Malnutrition spread quickly. Reports spoke of children fainting in schools, of women collapsing while scavenging ruins. Against that backdrop, the Thanksgiving meal was not merely generous, it was miraculous. For many of the women, it was the first time in years they had eaten until they were full. That physical reality carried an emotional weight words could scarcely contain. Hunger loosens the hardest certainties, and fullness plants seeds of doubt in the soil of hatred. The soldiers did not intend to make them cry. They simply wanted their own holiday, a reminder of home. Yet the unintended consequence was powerful. The women saw humanity where they had expected savagery, and in seeing it, they were forced to confront their own blindness. Some resented it, others embraced it, but none could erase it. The taste lingered long after the plates were cleared, an invisible reminder that truth can sometimes arrive dressed as gravy and bread rolls. Still, reconciliation was not guaranteed. The tears shed over Turkey did not erase the graves dug in France, nor the memories of bombs falling over Dresden. The conflict remained. How to live in a world where enemies could act with humanity. The women carried this conflict in silence, torn between relief and guilt, between gratitude and grief. As the mess hall emptied that evening, a soldier leaned against the doorway, watching them shuffle back to their quarters. He had fought through the Ardennes, had seen too much death to believe in miracles, yet he admitted later it was the strangest thing. We fed them, and it felt like the war cracked a little, right there at the table. He shook his head, still puzzled by it years later. And though the candles had burned down to stubs and the laughter had faded, the question remained, heavier with each passing day: if propaganda could collapse over a single meal, what else might fall next? Snow fell in faint flakes over the ruined town, softening jagged walls that still bore the scars of fire. Within the camp, the women returned to their barracks after Thanksgiving, carrying the taste of turkey like an ember hidden in their chests. It did not warm everything. Grief still lingered like smoke, but it flickered, refusing to die out. In the days that followed, conversations grew where silence had once reigned. Whispers became sentences, and sentences became quiet exchanges across tables. Something had shifted, as though the barbed wire surrounding them had loosened, not in iron, but in the mind. The collapse of barriers did not happen with fanfare. It arrived in gestures so small they might have gone unnoticed. A soldier handed a woman a cigarette, and instead of recoiling, she accepted, inhaling with shaking hands. Another dropped a chocolate bar on a bunk, pretending it was by accident, and the women, who had not tasted sweetness in years, broke it into pieces and shared it as though it were a sacrament. Each act chipped away at the vast wall of suspicion piece by piece until light began to shine through the cracks. Outside the camp, the world was starving. Reports from the winter of 1945 to 46 recorded calories plummeting below subsistence levels in many German towns. Children scavenged potato peels from garbage heaps, women stripped bark from trees to stretch flour. Against that bleak landscape, the rations shared by American soldiers became more than food. They became survival. Statistics cold on paper translated into warmth on skin and color in cheeks. Each full belly stood in stark contrast to neighbors just beyond the fences, gaunt and hollow-eyed. The women knew it, and guilt pressed against gratitude like two knives crossed. For one young prisoner, barely 23, the collapse of propaganda was almost unbearable. She had spent her teenage years cheering speeches, repeating slogans, clinging to certainty while bombs rained from the sky. Now she sat at a rough hewn table and chewed a Hershey bar given by a man whose name she would never know. Her tears surprised her. It was not only relief, but shame for believing lies, for swallowing them whole. She confessed in a whisper to her bunkmate, "If they are human, then what have we been?" The question rang like a bell no one wanted to answer. The soldiers, too, felt the change. They had been told not to fraternize, warned that sympathy might cloud discipline, but discipline eroded in the face of hunger and humanity. One GI from Nebraska remembered his own sisters when he looked at the women. Their hair was tangled, their dresses patched, but he could not see them as monsters. He said later, "They looked like my family would have if the war had come to my farm instead of theirs." That thought lingered, gnawing at him more than any regulation could. In the mess hall, barriers crumbled further. The women began to eat with less hesitation, though pride still stiffened their spines. Soldiers started to sit nearby, sharing stories of home in halting German, or gestures when words failed. A laugh over a spilled cup of coffee sounded almost ordinary. The strangeness was not in the act itself, but in its possibility. Enemies breaking bread without breaking each other. It startled both sides, as though humanity itself had crept in like contraband. History books often dwell on policies and treaties, but here the policy of mercy played out in human faces. Truman's administration had already begun sending shipments of wheat and cornmeal into Germany, understanding that starving millions would breed rebellion, not peace. The Marshall Plan was still 2 years away, yet seeds of its philosophy sprouted in these small exchanges. Food was strategy, but also revelation. You could not eat propaganda. You could not chew lies. The women learned this truth one bite at a time. One evening, a woman of 35, once a loyal party member, broke into sobs over a crust of bread softer than she remembered. Between tears she muttered, "All those years they told us." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Around her, others nodded, their silence thick with agreement. The collapse of barriers was not thunderous but quiet, like frost melting under weak sunlight. And yet it was no less irreversible. Even humor slipped through, tentative but real. A soldier mocked his own cooking, claiming the turkey had died twice, once in the field, once in the oven. The women laughed, not because the joke was sharp, but because it was absurd, and absurdity felt safer than grief. That laughter, foreign to their tongues, unsettled them as much as it freed them. Could one laugh with an enemy and remain loyal to memory? Could one eat with a captor and still cling to hate? Each smile weakened the answers they once thought certain. The collapse of barriers was not celebrated by all. Some soldiers grumbled that compassion was weakness. A few women clenched fists beneath tables, determined not to be softened. But cracks once formed spread. Even those who resisted felt hunger speak louder than pride. And hunger, when met with generosity, has the power to rewrite stories. By the third week after Thanksgiving, the women no longer flinched when a GI approached with bread. They no longer whispered about poison. They simply ate. And in eating, they admitted a new possibility. The enemy might not be who they had been told. What startled them most was not the food itself, but the recognition of similarity. The soldiers sang crude songs in English, laughed about letters from home, complained about superiors. These were not monsters, but men. Some carried photographs of wives or sweethearts. Some carved toys for children out of scrap wood. The women watched, bewildered. Propaganda had painted them as beasts. Yet here they were, young, human, fallible. Each observation struck like a hammer against the wall of lies until rubble piled at their feet. Still, the collapse of barriers did not mean peace of mind. With every bite of American food, the women felt the sting of betrayal. Betrayal not of country, but of the beliefs they had been forced to carry. One whispered, "If they lied to us about this, what else?" The question haunted them through the nights, stirring in the darkness like an unquiet ghost. The ground beneath their convictions was gone, and nothing yet replaced it. They floated in uncertainty, suspended between old loyalties and new truths. A corporal scribbled in his journal, later found in an archive. They cried when they ate. It was the strangest sight. I think the war ended for them at that table. For me, too, maybe. His words captured what numbers could not. Battles end with treaties, but wars end in hearts, often quietly without fanfare. In that barracks, on those cold nights, war was ending not through speeches, but through supper. As December advanced, the snow deepened. Hunger outside the camp grew worse. Lines at relief stations stretching for blocks. Inside, the women continued to receive meals that kept them alive. Each day widened the gap between what they had believed and what they experienced. By Christmas, the walls of propaganda had not only cracked, they had fallen, leaving questions too heavy to ignore. And yet, beneath the ruins of certainty, something fragile began to rise. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but a recognition of shared humanity. That recognition was dangerous, for it forced the women to confront not only their captors, but themselves. What they saw terrified them. The night before Christmas Eve, as the women lay in silence, one finally broke the quiet. "If they can show mercy," she whispered, "then what does that make us?" The words echoed in the darkness unanswered. For the first time, the enemy was not the only one under judgment. The candles of Thanksgiving had long burned down, yet their smoke lingered in memory, curling like invisible threads into the weeks that followed. Snow thickened over the Rhineland, muffling the ruins in silence, while the camp remained an island of uneasy order. Hunger outside gnawed sharper than ever, but within the wire the women were fed just enough to keep despair from hollowing them further. Each meal now carried not only nourishment, but an unspoken question. What would this kindness lead to? The war was over, but the verdict of peace was still undecided. By December, the shock of turkey had softened into routine. The women no longer froze in suspicion when trays were brought. They lined up with weary acceptance. Yet every bite still carried weight, a reminder that their survival depended on the very hands they had been taught to despise. It was not gratitude that filled them, at least not at first, but an ache, a strange blend of relief and humiliation. They lived, yes, but because of mercy granted by men they once called enemies. That paradox cut more deeply than hunger ever had. Among the soldiers, the mood was mixed. Some resented the effort,
seeing the women's tears as manipulative or undeserved. Others found themselves unsettled by the way grief and gratitude blurred together in those hollowed faces. A lieutenant wrote to his wife that December, confessing, "It's easier to fight them when they look like shadows in a field. Harder when they sit across a table crying into their food." His words captured the conflict both sides wrestled with, the collapse of distance between conqueror and conquered. And yet, despite the unease, something fragile began to take root. Acts of small generosity multiplied. A soldier shared a tin of coffee, another a pair of socks. One even taught a woman a clumsy phrase in English, and she repeated it back with shy laughter, the sound startling in its rarity. Such gestures were not grand, not formal, but they carved channels where reconciliation might someday flow. It was in the ordinary that the extraordinary began to emerge. Still, reconciliation was not simply handed over with bread rolls and butter. It demanded the breaking of pride. One woman who had once stood in torchlit rallies and shouted slogans with fervor now found herself clutching a cup of American cocoa as though it were a lifeline. She sipped, and tears welled unbidden. In that warmth she felt not only comfort but the searing recognition of deception, how she had been used, how her loyalty had been twisted. The cocoa was bitter with that realization, and yet she drank it all the same. Such moments spread like whispers impossible to contain. The officers, though pragmatic, recognized the symbolism. They understood that food was as much politics as sustenance. A well-fed prisoner could become an ally. A starving one would remain an enemy. Truman himself had spoken of mercy as strategy, declaring that America's strength lay not only in arms, but in generosity. And so the dinners, simple as they seemed, became unspoken lessons. Reconciliation, even when forced, began at the table. Statistics made the truth plain. By winter's end, millions of Germans were alive because Allied shipments of grain, powdered milk, and meat kept famine at bay. But numbers could not capture the tremor in a woman's hands as she accepted an apple from a GI, nor the way she turned it over as though holding a jewel. They could not measure the way soldiers softened when hearing laughter, where once there had been only silence. These were not charts or records. They were the slow stitching of human fabric thread by thread. Some resisted the stitching. Shame clung stubbornly. A few women ate but refused eye contact, muttering that survival was not the same as friendship. Pride, after all, was the last defense left to those who had lost everything, but even pride could not blind the senses. Butter melting on bread spoke louder than slogans. Warmth in the stomach outlasted cold warnings whispered by propaganda long collapsed. The body knew what the mind resisted. Kindness was harder to forget than cruelty.
By Christmas Eve, the camp was quieter than usual. Snow drifted against the barracks, muffling even the guards' footsteps. That night, a soldier passed around a harmonica, and another hummed a carol in English. To his surprise, a woman across the room joined softly in German, the melody bridging language where words could not. Others followed, voices tentative at first, then rising until the barracks filled with a hymn that belonged to both sides. Tears returned, not from hunger this time, but from the strange communion of sound. For a moment the war receded entirely. In its place stood something raw and trembling, the recognition that enemies shared songs, seasons, and sorrow. The next morning, bread was set out with small pats of butter shaped by hand. It was no feast, but the gesture was enough. The women ate slowly, as though prolonging a fragile peace. Some smiled faintly at the soldiers, uncertain but sincere. That Christmas, the first after surrender, was not marked by abundance, but by the quiet miracle of survival and the beginnings of trust carved out of ruins. Yet reconciliation carried shadows. For every tear of relief, there was one of grief. The women remembered husbands dead in fields, children lost in bombings, cities reduced to ash. They could not erase those memories, nor could soldiers forget comrades buried overseas. What emerged was not forgiveness, not yet, but the uneasy coexistence of memory and mercy. To weep over Turkey did not erase Dresden. To serve cocoa did not resurrect the fallen, but it marked the first fragile step toward a world where both sides might see one another not as enemies, but as people. In later years, some of the women would recall that first Thanksgiving meal as the moment the war truly ended for them. One testified in an oral history project her voice wavering even decades later. I believed everything they told us, that Americans would treat us like animals. And then that night I ate turkey and cried. I cried because I realized I had been lied to all my life. Her words crystallized the transformation better than any statistic. Reconciliation began not in speeches or treaties, but in the taste of food offered without demand. Still, the question lingered unresolved at the edge of every shared meal. If mercy could be found in the enemy, then what did that make of all the hatred, the blood, the sacrifices? The women carried that burden just as the soldiers carried theirs, and in that burden lay the central conflict. Could reconciliation truly take root in soil so soaked with grief? Or would the seeds planted in Turkey and tears wither under the frost of memory? As the year turned, snow gave way to the first thaw. Mud replaced ice, and with it came the slow stirring of hope. The women, though still captives, felt themselves less defined by chains and more by the fragile thread of survival shared with their guards. And yet beneath the surface, the question pressed harder with each passing day. If kindness had undone lies, what else might mercy reveal about the world they thought they knew?